College Football Nerds, we are here talking Indiana, Ohio State. We missed you guys last week. I say y'all. I know we got some northern folks in the house, but I can say y'all. We missed y'all last week after we talked about Ohio State and Maryland. We didn't get to have that game, so we're here talking about this next one. Got a model. We're gonna do this one really quick because some of the themes we're gonna talk about are a little bit of a repeat of what we had last time. Indiana fans, because I know all you Ohio State fans are already loving us. Thanks for posting us. Whoever did that on 11 Warriors last week, we like seeing that. Indiana fans, if you're new to this channel, we are nerdy. We generally talk statistics, but it's not just statistics. We have fun in other ways. We do break some game themes down as well. Josh, one of the themes we talked about going into this season for Big Ten fans was y'all be ready. It's going to get wild. Some teams are going to lose some games that you don't expect. It's COVID. It's herky-jerky start of the season, so just plan for it. But one of the things we said was we expected Ohio State to not be one of those teams. We saw Alabama come out and Clemson back then come out and look kind of unfazed from COVID, but said be prepared for the world around you to be a little shaky. And that has been the case. We've seen that with Penn State. We've seen that with Michigan and other teams. And unfortunately, it's sort of maybe giving Ohio State fans some frustration that they're not going to have the big pedigree wins or teams on their schedule because the records are going to be a little tarnished. And there's two things here, and I want you to distinguish between the notion that you're a bad team because you go 500 in your conference, when in reality that may not be the case. Talk about that. But also talk about how we got a little bit of a round robin thing going on, and it might not be great for some of these teams in the Big Ten.
So the first issue really regards win-loss record. And if you followed our show, we've kind of harped on this for several years. When you have a conference, right, you're going to have so many games, and somebody's going to win every game, and somebody's going to lose every game. The number of wins and losses are fixed within conference play. This year, you only have conference play. So in a normal year, you buttress it with 3 to 4 out-of-conference games that kind of give your win-loss record a jolt, and then you try to get some decent total in conference. Most year, the majority of teams are 500 or below, and sometimes you have more teams under 500 than you have 500 or above. The reason for that has to do with math. If you've got teams that are winning all their games, every game Ohio State wins, somebody else gets a loss. And so teams kind of share the losses and wins and losses, basically go 500 amongst each other. They take a loss from the big teams, and then you end up with a team like Ohio State going 8-0 in conference or 9-0 in conference, and everybody else gets that Ohio State loss, goes 500 elsewise, and that the Ohio State loss plus 500 against everybody else means you end up below 500. We're seeing that this year. And I want to touch on that idea that you've got the haves and the have-nots, because that's the round robin issue that Daniel just mentioned. There are 7 teams in the Big Ten that are effectively playing football, and there's 7 teams that aren't, is the best way to look at it. Michigan State, Rutgers, Penn State, Nebraska, Illinois, and Minnesota have only beaten each other. The best record in that group is 1-3, arguably 1-2 with Nebraska. No one has more than 1 win. No one in that group has beaten any one of the other 7 teams in the conference. And each one of them has at most 1 win only from each other. So they've all traded a win, lost to each other once, and then lost to somebody else. And that somebody else is Indiana, Ohio State, Maryland, Northwestern, Wisconsin, Purdue, and Iowa. Now, this leads into another interesting point, and it's one of the challenges for us in picking up these 2 games. If you agree with us, or you at least see the point that there are 7 teams that have been winning, and there's 7 teams that can only beat each other, who have Indiana and Ohio State played? And unfortunately, they have only played the 7 have-nots. Their wins come entirely from teams that have only beaten each other and have not beaten any teams at the top. I'll note that's not necessarily unique, but it creates a challenge. Because how do you evaluate Indiana and Ohio State, given that both teams have really effectively only played teams that are struggling to play football? I will say, before I hand it back to you, I do think there's an argument that Penn State and Nebraska are really, even despite Penn State's record, maybe the best two of that group. Penn State has had, they've had their ups and downs, but they've also had some tough draws and scheduling. But I think they kind of look like at least they're playing football this season. Nebraska, they haven't played very many games. They've struggled, but I feel like they also look like they're playing football. What do you think on that? And I'll give you one factoid here. Penn State, for example, we talk about the haves and the have-nots. Penn State has only played teams in the top half plus Nebraska. So there's an argument that they just haven't had a chance to get their easy wins.
Well, that's tough for me because they were getting blown out by Nebraska at one point by a quarterback that was not the starter to start the season and hadn't been getting all the first-team reps. They came back and made it a little closer than it was, but it really looked to me like they had given up in the first half of that game. The Indiana game, it's interesting. We're talking about Indiana, who is going to get credit for that win, and they should get credit for that win, but they were statistically dominated by Penn State in that game. But I think Penn State and Michigan are, it's tough because when you beat these name brand teams at the beginning of the year that have high expectations, those wins to me are worth more than beating them at the end of the year when they've given up. We've seen this with LSU a lot, where they're really good to start the season. They're coming off a great year. They have high expectations, then they're tough out. And then once the national championship or the conference championship is off the board, they fall off, and then they lose to Arkansas at the end of the year. I think we've got some of that with Penn State and Michigan this year where, beating them early in the season really meant something, and it's going to carry with me to the end of the season. So talking about Indiana, I think that, and one of the things that Indiana fans will learn about us on this show is we're brutally honest. We give credit where it's due, but we also don't chase clicks and fans by saying things that just make them happy. And one of the things that you pointed out when we talked about the Indiana-Penn State game was that they got statistically dominated. You took some good away from them. In my opinion, there's a lot of people talking about how Indiana can shock Ohio State in this game. And to me, it feels a lot like our Penn State preview, where even the numbers might say it'll be relatively close, and some of the hype might say it'll be relatively close. But in the end, and this is not a slight to Indiana, I think this is a 41-24 kind of game. And it says more good again about Ohio State than it does bad about Indiana. That's probably my final pick for the game. But tell me what the numbers say. Let's get into that, and then we can kind of pivot off of it.
I think this is maybe the first time we've run the model for Big Ten audience, so I'll introduce it a little bit. Our model works on a per play basis, and it's entirely opponent adjusted. So we don't do a holistic ranking. We don't rank teams 1 through 130. We pair teams against each other, and it creates a matchup. It really does that in two ways. It looks how you did against the teams you played. It looks at how the teams you played did against other teams and gets an idea of your strengths and weaknesses. And then it looks at how you operated in games in order to score points. So there is sort of a self-learning scoring model built into this that once I have an idea of your strengths and weaknesses, I get an idea of your production against this opponent based off their strengths and weaknesses, and then I map it to your team's individual scoring profile. And the idea here is to have a neutral baseline model. As we say a lot, the model is designed to say if you both play your B-plus game, what does the score look like based purely only on how you've done this season? And using that, we have a pretty neutral baseline to have a discussion, in which you can say the numbers are slanted in someone's favor or not, but at the very least, we have a reasonable point, unbiased set of numbers to go off of. One of the things we discuss a lot is an intermediary statistic our model generates, and that's a percentage of opponent averages allowed. Defensive and offensive numbers in college football are, quite frankly, kind of worthless in isolation. A lot of times people apply NFL properties to college football when they're trying to do advanced statistics. We fight that a lot, and the reason is in the NFL there's a lot of parity. You play a lot of games against a lot of the same teams. The difference between the best team and the worst team really isn't that great, or at least it's nowhere near what you see in college football where the disparity is massive. Because of that, you have to be really careful that you're constantly adjusting for opponent opponent capabilities. How good is their offense? How bad is their defense? How bad or good have they been in other games? Because a statistic in and of itself that's not opponent adjusted. And I'm going to rankle a feather. I don't know if you'll ever see it, but a lot of people use EPA, estimated points added. That statistic isn't opponent adjusted. I don't personally believe you can use that in college football because your schedule is going to determine that statistic more than how good you are. Our percentage of opponent averages allowed is a totally opponent adjusted statistic. And in that statistic, Ohio State allows other teams to have 99% of their rush averages and 111% of their passing averages. In other words, they get their average day running and better than their average day passing when they play Ohio State. Indiana's at 97 and 95%, which is generally about average. We usually say, by the way, average to be lower than 100% because usually you've got junk opponents thrown in. Our numbers this year are a little bit more meaningful because they're only in conference play. Everything's kind of siloed and it's all a little bit cleaner. The result of that, though, is you take those defensive statistics, which, again, Ohio State's actually shockingly average in that, and Indiana's merely above average. I know they've had some good performances, but I'm telling you, statistically, it has more to do with their opponents than anything on both sides of the ball. And you apply it to the particular offenses in this game. And the difference in the teams in our model is 100% the offenses. Ohio State's averaging over 10 yards per attempt, over 4.5 yards per carry. That's we say 4.5 yards per carry is a sort of the good mark for rush offense. 7.5 yards per attempt is good on passing offense. So Ohio State's elite passing the ball and pretty good running it. Indiana doesn't hit either mark. 2.67 yards per carry. That's bad. That's quite anemic. 7.1 yards per attempt is just barely serviceable, but it's not good. And when you consider that Ohio State's defensive statistics are average, and again, really it means average by Big Ten standards, the gap offensively is too much. Ohio State's expected to get over 7 yards per play. Indiana about 5.5. 5.5 is enough to move the ball. It's not enough to score at will. And Ohio State pretty much can. So the model here has it at 45-31. It's only one touchdown off Daniel's prediction, and it does kind of indicate that typical, a good team playing an elite team where you stay in it for a half, and in the second half the other team pulls away just because they've got too much depth and too much offensive firepower.
And this, to me, the number isn't surprising. I think the model's struggling a little bit this year with the fact that we don't have any low baseline data to fill it in with. We've got just conference opponents. And this is why with Indiana, a lot of people are going to be frustrated if they're Indiana fans if we see them drop a few games this year and say, gosh, they're a 500. What if they end up being 500 in the league? Well, that's better than normal, in my opinion. It's kind of like the Kentucky example you gave, where Kentucky has been a good team in the past, and I'm not saying Indiana and Kentucky are analogous this year. I'm saying in the past, when Kentucky was like a 9 or 10 win team, a lot of years they were either 500 or one game over in the conference, but they had the out of conference games that they won all of, and then they won their bowl game. Whereas this year, if you go 500 on, let's say an SEC team goes 500, they're 5-5, and that's not great. But realistically, that could be historically, an 8-5 kind of team. So we've got to look at this differently. And the other thing I'll say for Indiana fans is, one, we actually really like your team this year. Seeing what they're doing, they're outperforming expectation. And we've said for the last few years, Indiana is a team that gets overlooked as a tough out in the Big Ten, and it's not fair. Just like it's not fair that Kentucky, when they're a 10-win team, gets overlooked because of name brand or whatever. Last year, Indiana was a tough out, and they they gave Tennessee all they wanted, and that Tennessee team wasn't playing bad at the end of the year. So, having said all that, Indiana fans need to realize that we consider Ohio State as one of the 3 or 4 teams that, after those 3 or 4 teams, there's a massive drop-off. So explain that a little bit in terms of you can be 17, 20, 25 points worse than the best team in the country and still be a top 5, top 8 kind of team. And we don't say, hey, you got blown up by number 1, therefore, you may not even be a top 25 team.
This concept's only really increased in recent years, but it's sort of always been true. College football does not have parity, Some teams recruit at a higher level than other teams. Some teams, frankly, invest more resources. They're better coached. They have more continuity, whatever you want to say. Those teams operate at a completely different tier. In recent years, and I think this is going to continue, by the way, as long as we have a playoff like we do, the haves are that much better than the have-nots. And because you can afford a loss, it kind of keeps the teams at the top always in the discussion for the playoff, and that momentum always continues. The worst player in an Ohio State class, or, let's say if they sign 25 guys, the 20th best guy in that class would be often the second or third best guy in a class at most other schools like Indiana. It's kind of ridiculous. And the reality of that is when those Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson's play people, their worst day makes it an even matchup. And most of the time it goes unnoticed, but they'll play a top 25 team and they win by 30 points. We notice when it comes on the ticker that they're, in a close game and we pay attention. But I think people miss just how often Ohio State or in Alabama walks into those games. They blow it out by the first quarter, and it's never close. And it's just the reality of it. I mean, the level, because of the nature of recruiting, because you can choose your school, there's no draft, it's just a massive gap. I think in this current class, it's something like 1 in 8 kids in the top 100 is committed to Alabama, and then Ohio State's beyond that. But if you look at I think it's Alabama, it's like Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, and somebody else. They've got like 1 in 3 kids in the top 100. It's like 3 or 4 schools. They're playing a different game. You can be good enough to beat anyone in the country other than those 3 and lose to one of those 3 or 4 teams by 20 to 30 points. And it's completely reasonable. And to your point, like a good team goes 500 or maybe slightly above in conference play. And in most years, and the example I had given when we were discussing was Kentucky, they went 4-4 a couple years ago in conference play. They won their 4 out-of-conference games. They won their bowl. They finished 9-4. So a 500 schedule in conference play is a 9-win team. Can be in the Big Ten, you can be a 10-win team and go right about 500 in conference play. That's unfortunately not going to be that way this year. I think Indiana being at 4-0 is a big deal. I think they're going to end with a really good record. I think they're going to, they're capable of beating most teams on the schedule, but unfortunately that just doesn't translate against a true elite.
Go ahead and give me, I think I said 41-24 for me. And to me, just to give Indiana fans a little perspective, we picked, like, this is giving Indiana a lot of credit. We picked a bigger margin, I think, for Maryland. We picked about this margin for Penn State when we thought Penn State was really good. And we picked a blowout for the Nebraska game of, I think, like 52-17, 52-20 was the kind of what we were saying. So give me your score, and then I'll wrap it up.
My score in this game, I think it's pretty fair. I think it's more, you have it 41-24 or something like that. I think it's a little higher scoring. I don't think the model is far off. I would say, I'll say 44-27. I think the teams are going to get their points. Ohio State has struggled to keep teams from scoring late in games. Their secondary has some limitations and issues. We've seen that. Really, we've seen it throughout college football. It's taken everybody about 5 games for anyone to play good defense unless you have a large number of returning starters. And, I don't think Ohio State's quite there yet, especially with a canceled game. So I do think Indiana scores points. I'll give you my real analysis because we haven't said a whole lot. Personally, I think Indiana is, and I think a lot of people see this, they're more a defensive team than an offensive team. Penix Jr. gets a lot of credit for the great throws he makes, but he's a little too inconsistent to win this kind of game. When Indiana's defense is able to hold to a team to under 35 points, you take a guy like Penix and he can, throw the ball and hit small window NFL level throws that are undefendable, and you can get points on the board despite the fact that I think Indiana's a little limited overall offensively. I think they got a good run game, but there's not a ton of weapons on the team compared to, I'm comparing you right now to top 15 teams. And if you compare them with somebody like a Florida or what have you, it's not quite there top to bottom offensively, even like a Texas A&M, for example. But in this game, because of that maverick ability from him is enough to get you to something like 27. I just don't think that you can stop a team like Ohio State. And that's the last thing I want to end on for people who haven't heard us talk about this year. Elite offenses score 35 to 45 points consistently no matter what. Under the RPO rules and the current rule set, it's too slanted towards offenses, and you can't hold someone under 35 if they are an elite offense. Indiana is just not equipped right now to win that kind of a game. So this is kind of the ceiling for them. They can beat a lot of really good teams that are defensively minded. I would give them a decent shot at beating like a Georgia in the SEC, but they're not going to beat a high-level team that has the kind of offense that's going to score 40-plus and any good defense, just because they're too inconsistent offensively.
All right, y'all, that's it for us on this one. Indiana fans, I hope y'all didn't think that the tenor of this was too negative. We really do like your team. And like Josh said, we would give you a decent shot against other highly ranked teams. It's just this matchup is a little tough. Let us know what you think the score is going to be, and Indiana fans, let us know what you think about the show if it's your first time hearing us talk. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.